Well, I mentioned a collection of novellas that is not called salmagundi. Salmagundi actually means a collection of disparate elements, and so it's very appropriate for a collection of fiction. It's also the name for an 18th century dish, which was basically whatever the cook had left in the kitchen when you needed to fill in a gap in the meal. So salmagundi could include everything from hard-boiled eggs to lobsters, and quite a few things in between. So I thought that was a good name, but I was overruled. Anyway. It has 7 novellas in it. 5 of these have already been published either in anthologies or as standalone ebooks, so they'll be collected in one place for people who would like an actual book. But there are 2 more novellas, which I'm working on now. I usually work on more than one project at a time, so I think I have a benign form of ADD. I have trouble working on anything for more than 20 minutes at a time. But I learned when I had 2 full-time jobs and 3 children under the age of 6 that, I just couldn't get up and wander off when I got stuck, which is the normal thing to do. Most people would just get up and get a cup of coffee, take the dog for a walk, go to the bathroom. They don't come back, and that's why they don't finish their books. I couldn't do that because I was getting paid for the stuff I was writing. And so I would start with a grant proposal, which is the absolute worst thing to write ever. And it doesn't matter what I'm writing, it sticks 2/3 of the way down the page, so I'd get that far. And then I would just, I wouldn't waste time wrestling with it. I'd just reach for the next review on my pile of software projects that I was writing for Byte or InfoWorld or whoever, and I'd start that one out. Software reviews are easy because they're formatted. You put in the headings and then you just kind of fill them up in any order you like. And so I'd get as far as I could with that one, and then I'd check back with the grant proposal. If nothing had shook loose yet, I would start on a scene from the novel that I was sneakily writing without telling anybody. And I wrote Outlander for practice, as a matter of fact. Jesse was asking me over dinner why it happens to be set in Scotland. And I actually didn't get as far in the conversation as telling him because I got sidetracked telling him a few other things about it. But the reason is that I decided that it was a practice book, as I said. I wasn't going to tell anybody what I was doing. But I thought about, what I needed to write a book to learn how, basically. So I said, what's the easiest kind of book to write? And I thought for me that might be historical fiction because I was a research professor. I used to be a scientist in my previous life. 2 of my degrees, a BS and a PhD, are from NAU. They gave me an honorary doctorate a few years ago when they wanted a free commencement speaker. I don't usually use that one. In fact, when our kids were in high school and started worrying about what's going to be my major in college and so forth, we said, look, don't worry about it. I said, between us, Daddy and I have 5 degrees. We don't use any of them. Not that I never have, but not for a few years. Okay, so anyway, it's set in Scotland because I said, okay, historical fiction might be the easiest. Where am I going to set this? Because I got no background in history. Any time would do as well as another. I'd have to look it all up anyway. So I was checking for appealing time and place, and I was thinking 15th century Venice, American Civil War, what sounds attractive. And I happened to see a really old Doctor Who rerun on public television. This was a really old one. It was one of the Patrick Troughton episodes. And anyway, you probably know who Doctor Who is. He's a time traveler who picks up companions from different periods of Earth's history as he travels around having adventures. And in this particular series of episodes, he had picked up a young Scotsman from 1745. This was a young man, 1819, who appeared in his kilt. And I thought, that's kind of fetching. And I found myself still thinking about this the next day in church. And I said, well, it doesn't really matter where you set this. So, why not? Scotland, 18th century. So that's where I began, knowing nothing about Scotland or the 18th century, having no plot, no outline, and no characters. Nothing but the rather vague images conjured up by the notion of a man in a kilt. And as those of you who have been admiring James's kilt can testify, this is a very powerful and compelling image. In fact, my 6th book was very lucky. I won several prizes for it, including the Corina International Prize for Fiction, which was cool. And I got to go be awarded it in Germany. Well, while I was there, the German publisher had me interviewed by people right, left, and sideways from everything from the local National Enquirer to Vanity Fair. And toward the end of this week, after back-to-back interviews all day, every day, I was just kind of swaying from weariness. And I was talking to a nice gentleman from a literary journal. He said, I've read all of your books in the original. And I'm thinking, good. And he said, and your imagery is so transcendent, your narrative drive is tremendous, and your characters are so three-dimensional. I'm thinking, yes, go on. And instead, he paused and said, there's just this one thing. I wonder, can you explain to me what is the appeal of a man in a kilt? And And I was really tired, or I might not have said it. I just looked at him for a minute and I said, well, I suppose it's the idea that you could be up against a wall with him in a minute. Yes, and anyway, 3 weeks later I was at home and I got this pile of press clips from this journey. On top of it was that one. In German. Yeah, I can read German, but very slowly. And the publisher had put a Post-it note on it that said, I don't know what you told this man, but I think he is in love with you. I mean, a very powerful and compelling image. So anyway, that's why Outlander's set in Scotland. And I will read you another little bit about the man in a kilt in just a bit. But in between, I thought maybe I would read you a small chunk of the novella that I'm working on right now. It's called A Fugitive Green, and this is an artistic term. During the Middle Ages and so forth, it was very difficult to paint with the green paint because every pigment they had faded. And if you painted with green, it looked good for a month or two, and then it began to fade. So they called it a fugitive green, and there was quite a search for, a permanent green, which I don't think they actually really got until well on into the 20th century. But anyway, that's what it's called. And this book doesn't have that much to do with art, but it has a lot to do with botany. And that's the fugitive green. Anyway, this is actually the end of the story. I don't write romance novels as such, but this novella actually is a romance in that it describes how two people actually come together and reach the point of marriage and so forth. On this particular one, we're dealing with Harold Gray, who is he's the Duke of Pardlow, but he doesn't use that title because his father shot himself after being accused of treason, so he's not going to use it until his father's name is cleared. And so he goes by his lesser title, Lord Melton. He's also trying to resurrect his father's extinct regiment, which was decommissioned, and having a devil of a time at it. This is not helped by the fact that his wife was seduced by his best friend, whom he then shot on the man's croquet lawn. And it's not actually meant to be funny, but it is. And Hal kind of has a talent for that. And then his pregnant wife died in childbirth. Consequently, he's a little bit unhinged when he meets a young woman whom he thinks is a reputable book dealer, a dealer in rare books who's been sent over by her father to make book deals, and she has, but her father has a sideline in intelligence, and it is her real mission to steal incriminating letters. Anyway, she steals his wife's letters and his, and all kinds of things happen. However, after a few things that I won't describe, she ends up pregnant and with her father in Amsterdam, and is sort of just getting down to life. She has no concern. She can make it on her own, and especially with her father and all that. But Hal comes. He's been looking for her for the last 6 months. Has finally tracked her down, and he strides into her father's bookshop, picks her up, as she says to Hal's brother later on. She said, "I was most impressed. I must have weighed 11 stone," and carries her out to a waiting carriage. She took a deep breath and readjusted her skirts over her bulge. "Where do you think you're taking me?" He'd been staring at her intensely, but evidently without actually seeing her, for her words made him jerk. "What?" "Where are you taking me?" she repeated, louder. "I don't know," he said, and looked at Harry beside him. "Where are we going?" "Place on the Herengracht," Harry said with a shrug, "called the Vrolijke Schipper, the Jolly Boatman." "You're taking me to a pub?" Her voice rose involuntarily. "I'm taking you to be married," Hal said, frowning at her. He was very pale, and a muscle near his mouth twitched. The only thing he couldn't control, she thought. Well, that and her. "I married a lady, and she became a whore. I cannot complain if it should be the other way about this time." "You think I'm a whore, do you?" She wasn't sure whether to be amused or insulted. Perhaps both. "Do you normally sleep with your victims, madam?" She gave him a long, level stare and folded her arms atop the rounded curve of her belly. "I wasn't asleep, Your Grace, and if you had been, I think I would have noticed." The Jolly Boatman was a rather down-at-heel establishment with a drunkard bundled in rags picturesquely huddled against the steps. "Why did you pick this place?" she asked Harry, picking up her skirts to avoid a small heap of vomit on the stones and glancing at the grimy doorknob. "The landlady's husband is a minister," he said reasonably, leaning to open the door for her, and reputed not to be too fussed about things. Things like a wedding license, she supposed, though perhaps you didn't need one when getting married in a different country. "Go in," said Hal impatiently behind her. "It stinks out here." "And you think it will be better inside?" she asked, pinching her nose in preparation. He was right, though. The breeze had shifted, and she caught the full impact of the drunkard's scent. "Oh, God," she said, turned neatly on her heel, and threw up on the opposite side of the step. "Oh, God," said Hal. "Never mind, I'll get you some gin. Now go inside, for God's sake." He pulled a large white handkerchief out of his sleeve, wiped her mouth briskly with it, and hustled her inside. Harry had already gone in and opened negotiations in bad but serviceable Dutch, this augmented by a substantial purse which he plonked on the bar with a loud clinking noise. Hal, who apparently had no Dutch, interrupted Harry's conversation with the landlady behind the bar by removing a coin from his pocket, which he tossed onto the bar. "Gin," he said. Minnie had subsided onto a stool as soon as she entered and was curled over, eyes shut, and Hal's handkerchief clutched in one hand, trying not to breathe. A moment later, though, the sharp, clean scent of juniper cut through the miasma of the pub and the hint of dead rat. She swallowed, made herself sit up, and took the cup of gin Hal handed her. To her considerable surprise, it worked. The nausea subsided with the first sip, the desire to lie down on the floor faded, and within a few moments she felt relatively normal, or as normal as one might feel if 6 months pregnant and on the verge of marrying Hal, she thought. The minister, apparently rousted from bed, and apparently suffering from an extreme form of la grippe, turned bleary eyes from Hal to Minnie, then back. "You want to marry her?" The tone of incredulity seeped through the nasal congestion, slow and glutinous. "Yes," said Hal. "Now, if you please." The minister closed one eye and looked at him, then turned his head slowly to his wife, who tutted impatiently and said something rapid in Dutch, accompanied by a peremptory gesture. He hunched his shoulders against the tirade, in a way indicating that such assaults were common. When she stopped speaking, he nodded in a resigned fashion, drew a sodden handkerchief from the pocket of his sagging breeches, and blew his nose. Hal's hand tightened on Minnie's. He hadn't let go since they'd entered the pub, and she twitched, not quite pulling away. He looked down at her. "Sorry," he said, and loosened, but didn't release his grip. "She's with child," said the minister in a reproachful tone. "I know that," Hal said, tightening his hold once more. "Get on with it, please, at once." "Why?" said Minnie, mildly provoked. "Do you have somewhere special you have to be?" "No," he said, narrowing his eyes at her, "but I want the child to be legitimate, and I think you may give birth to it at any moment." "I will not," she said, offended. "You know I'm no more than 6 months gone." "You look like it." Catching a glimpse of her eyes at this point, he shut his mouth abruptly, coughed, and turned his attention once more to the minister. "Do please continue, sir." The man nodded, blew his nose again, and motioned to his wife, who bent to rummage beneath the bar, eventually emerging with a battered book of prayer, its cover spotted with cronk rings. Possessed of this talisman, the minister seemed to take heart and straightened up a little. "You have witnesses?" he asked Hal. "Yes," said Hal, impatient. "He's Harry?" "Damn it," he went out to pay the carriage. "Stay here," he commanded Minnie, and dropping her hand, strode out. The minister looked dubiously after him, then at Minnie. The end of his nose was moist and scarlet, and tiny veins empurpled his cheeks. "You are willing to marry this man?" he said. "I see he is rich, but maybe it better to take a poor man who will treat you well." "Sie ist das Mann den met kind, idiot," said the minister's wife. "She's 6 months gone with child. Ist die Bastard wie the Wanger gemacht?" She removed the pipe from the corner of her mouth and gestured from the door to Minnie's belly. "He's the bastard who got you pregnant?" A hefty kick from the occupant made her grunt and double over. "Ja, ist die Bastard," she assured the woman, glancing over her shoulder to the door where Hal's shadow in the window was visible, a larger shadow that must be Harry behind him. The woman exchanged a look with her husband. Both shrugged, and the minister opened the book and began thumbing through it in a helpless sort of way. Harry smiled reassuringly at Minnie and patted her hand before lining up solidly beside Hal. Oddly enough, she did feel reassured. If a man like Harry was Hal's good friend, then perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't wrong about him. Not that it would make any difference at this point, she thought, feeling a strangely pleasant shiver run up her back. It felt as though she were about to jump off a cliff, but feeling a pair of great wings unfurl at her back, even as she looked out into the wind. "Wat zijn uw naam, alstublieft?" "What are your names, please?" The landlady had pulled out a register book. It might be the accounts for the pub, Minnie thought, looking at the stained pages. But the woman turned to a clean blank page at the back of the book and dipped her quill, expectant. Hal looked blank for a moment, then said firmly, "Harold Gray." "Only 2 names?" Minnie said, surprised. "No titles?" "No," he said. "It's not the Duke of Pardlow or even the Earl of Melton you're marrying. Just me." "Sorry to disappoint you if that's what you thought," he added, in a tone that actually sounded apologetic. "Not at all," she said politely. "My middle name's Patricius," he blurted. "Harold Patricius Gerard Bleecker Gray." "Really?" "Ik ben het geschreven van Aldier," the woman objected. "I'm not going to write all that." "Bleecker, that is Netherlands," the minister said in surprised approval. "Your family is Dutch?" "My father's mother's mother," Hal said, equally surprised. The woman shrugged and wrote down Harold Bleecker Gray, repeating the words to herself. "And she asked, looking up at Minnie. Minnie would have thought her heart couldn't go any faster, but she was wrong. Loose as her stays were, she felt lightheaded, and before she could gather enough breath to speak, Hal stepped in. "She's called Minerva Rennie," he told the woman. "Actually, it's Wattiswade," she said, getting a solid breath. Hal looked down at her, frowning. "Wattiswade? What's Wattiswade?" "Not what," she said with exaggerated patience. "Who? Me, in fact." This appeared to be too much for Hal, who looked to Harry for help. "She means her name isn't Rennie, old man. It's Wattiswade." "Nobody's named Wattiswade," Hal objected, transferring the frown back to Minnie. "I'm not marrying you under an assumed name." I'm not bloody marrying you under an assumed name, she said. Gah! What? Your bloody baby kicked me in the liver. Oh, Hal looked somewhat abashed. You mean your name really is Wattiswade, then? Yes, I do. He took a deep breath. All right, Wattiswade. Why, never mind, you'll tell me later why you've been calling yourself Rennie. No, I won't. He glanced at her, brows raised high, and she could see him, for once, debating whether to say something. But then his eyes lost the look of a man talking to himself and focused on hers. All right, he said softly, and held out his hand to her, palm upward. She took another breath and jumped. Cunegonda, she said, and put her hand in his. Minerva Cunegonda Wattiswade. He said nothing, but she could feel him vibrating slightly. She carefully didn't look at him. Harry seemed to be arguing about something with the woman, something to do with the need for a second witness, she thought, but couldn't concentrate enough to make out the words. The smell of tobacco smoke and stale sweat was making her gorge rise again, and she swallowed hard several times. All right, they decided that Mrs. Ten Boom could be the second witness. Good. The baby turned a somersault. Perspiration had broken out on Minnie's temples, and her ears felt hot. Suddenly, she was possessed by the fear that her father would burst through the door at any moment. She wasn't afraid of his stopping this impromptu ceremony. She was quite sure Hal wouldn't let him, and that certainty steadied her. Still, she didn't want him here. This was hers alone. Hurry, she said to Hal in a low voice. Please, hurry. Get on with it, he said to the minister in a voice that wasn't particularly loud, but plainly expected to be obeyed. The man blinked, coughed, and opened his book. It was all in Dutch. She could have followed the words, but didn't. What echoed in her ears were the never-spoken phrases from the letters. Not Esme's, his. Letters written to a dead wife in passionate grief, in fury, and despair. He might as well have punctured his own wrist with the sharpened quill and written those words in blood. She looked up at him now, pale as the winter sky, as though all the blood had run out of his body, leaving him drained. But his eyes were a pale and piercing blue when he turned his face toward her, and the fire in him was not quenched by any means. You didn't deserve him, she thought toward the absent Esme, and rested her free hand on her gently heaving stomach. But you loved him. Don't fret. I'll take care of them both. I don't want to keep people here all night. Do we have time to read one more, or don't? Yes? Yeah, I mean, don't hesitate to say no if you'd like me to stop. All right, it's not too long. It is, it takes place toward the very beginning of Book 9, Go Tell the Bees, and so forth. And it's after the new generations have arrived and so forth, and they've gone off to bed and have left Jamie and Claire by their bonfire on the top of the hill where the new house is about to be built. And, they're contemplative and, moved and emotional and all that sort of stuff. And, they talk through all kinds of things. And finally come down to, sort of the things married people come down to. And Jamie begins to reminisce about the night we made Faith, Faith being their first daughter who was stillborn. I lifted my head in surprise. You know when she was conceived? I don't know that. He ran his hand slowly down my back, fingers pausing to rub circles in the small of it. If I'd been a cat, I would have waved my tail gently under his nose. You don't want to know what my husband put in the margin after that. I suppose I could be wrong, but I've always thought it was the night I came to your bed at the Abbey. For a moment I groped among my memories. That time at the Abbey of St. Anne, when I'd come so close to a self-chosen death, was one I seldom revisited. It was a terrifying time of fear and confusion, despair and desperation. And yet, when I did look back, I found a handful of vivid images, standing out like the illuminated letters on a page of ancient Latin. Father Anselm's face, pale in candlelight, his eyes warm with compassion, and then the growing glow of wonder as he heard my confession. The abbot's hands, touching Jamie's forehead, eyes, lips, and palms, delicate as a hummingbird's touch, anointing his dying nephew with the holy chrism of extreme unction. The quiet of the darkened chapel where I had prayed for his life and heard my prayer answered. And among these moments was the night when I woke from sleep to find him standing, a pale wraith by my bed, naked and freezing, so weak he could barely walk, but filled once more with life and a stubborn determination that would never leave him. You remember her then? My hand rested lightly on my stomach, recalling. He'd never seen her or felt her as more than random kicks and pushes from inside me. He kissed my forehead briefly, then looked at me. You can, I do, don't you? Yes, I just wanted you to tell me more. Oh, I mean to. He settled himself on one elbow and gathered me in so I could share his plate. Do you remember that too? I asked, pulling down the fold of cloth he draped over me. Sharing your plate with me the night we met? To keep you from freezing? Aye. He kissed the back of my neck. It was me freezing at the Abbey. I'd worn myself out trying to walk, and you wouldn't have let me eat anything, so I was starving to death, and, oh, you know that's not true. Would I lie to you, Sassenach? Yes, you bloody would, I said. You do it all the time. But never mind that now. We were freezing and starving, and suddenly decided that instead of asking Brother Roger for a blanket or a bowl of something hot, you should stagger naked down a dark stone corridor and get in bed with me. Some things are more important than food, Sassenach. His hand settled firmly on my arse, and finding out whether I could ever bed you again was more important than anything else just then. I reckoned if I couldn't, I'd just walk on out into the snow and not come back. Naturally, it didn't occur to you to wait for a few more weeks and recover your strength. Well, I was fairly sure I could walk that far leaning on the walls, and I'd be doing the rest lying down, so why wait? The hand on my arse was idly stroking it now. You do recall the occasion. It was like making love to a block of ice. It had been. It had also wrung my heart with tenderness and filled me with a hope I'd thought I'd never know again. Besides, you thawed out after a bit. Only a bit at first. I just cradled him against me, trying as hard as possible to generate body heat. I'd pulled off my shift, urgent to get as much skin contact as possible. I remembered the hard, sharp curve of his hip bone, the knobs of his spine, and the ridged, fresh scars over them. You weren't much more than skin and bones. I turned, drew him down beside me now, and pulled him close, wanting the reassurance of his present warmth against the chill of memory. He was warm and alive, very much alive. You put your leg over me to keep me from falling out the bed. I remember that. He rubbed my leg slowly, and I could hear the smile in his voice, though his face was dark with the fire behind him sparking in his hair. It was a small bed. It had been a narrow monastic cot, scarcely large enough for one normal-sized person, and even starved as he was, he'd occupied a lot of space. I wanted to roll you onto your back, Sassenach, but I was afraid I'd pitch us both out onto the floor, and, well, I wasn't sure I could hold myself up. He'd been shaking with cold and weakness, but now I realized probably with fear as well. I took the hand resting on my hip and raised it to my mouth, kissing his knuckles. His fingers were cold from the evening air and tightened on the warmth of mine. You managed, I said softly, and rolled onto my back, bringing him with me. Only just, he murmured, finding his way through the layers of quilt-plaid shirt and shift. He let out a long breath, and so did I. Oh, Jesus, Sassenach. He moved just a little. What it felt like, he whispered then, to think I'd never have you again, and then. He had managed, and it was just barely. I thought I'd do it if it was the last thing I ever did. It almost bloody was, I whispered back, and took hold of his bottom, firm and round. I really did think you died for a moment, until you started to move. Thought I was going to, he said with the breath of a laugh. Oh, God, Claire. He stopped for a moment, lowered himself, and pressed his forehead against mine. He'd done it that night, too, cold-skinned and fierce with desperation, and I'd felt I was breathing my own life into him then, his mouth so soft and open, smelling faintly of the ale mixed with egg that was all he could keep down. I wanted, he whispered, I wanted you. I had to have you. But once I was inside you, I wanted... He sighed then deep and moved deeper. I thought I'd die of it then and there. And I wanted to. Wanted to go while I was inside you. His voice had changed, still soft, but somehow distant, detached, and I knew he'd moved away from the present moment, gone back to the cold stone dark, and the panic, the fear and overwhelming need. I wanted to spill myself into you and let that be the last I ever knew. But then I started, and it wasn't meant to be that way, but that I would keep myself inside you forever, that I was giving you a child. He'd come back in the speaking, back into the now and into me. I held him tight, big and solid and strong in my arms, and shaking, helpless as he gave himself up. I held warm tears well up and slide down cold into my hair. After a time, he stirred and rolled off onto his side. A big hand still rested light on my belly. I did manage, he said, and smiled a little, firelight soft on his face. You did, I said, and pulling the plaid back over us, I lay with him, content in the light of dying flame and eternal stars.